If she is really going to marry in this dump, I am not walking her down the aisle, my dad said. I refuse to let our $2 million family be seen in a place that smells like cheap disinfectant. His voice came straight through the thin door of the side room at Riverside Community Center and settled in my chest like a weight. I stood there in a rented white dress, fingers tight around a bouquet of grocery store flowers, listening to my own father talk about me like I was bad advertising. My stepmother answered before I could even take a breath. "Mark let her," Cassandra said, calm and sharp. "When people see this cheap wedding, they will know it is not a reflection of us. We belong to the lake house crowd, remember?" Folding chairs creaked as guests shifted. I could picture the quick glances, the forced smiles, the quiet decision to pretend they had not heard. Cassandra's jewelry chimed softly as she adjusted her necklace. "She had a perfectly good offer," she went on. Country club full bar my planner. She said no, so she can own this embarrassment." Dad exhaled, annoyed. "And she still wants me to walk her down the aisle," he muttered, "after refusing everything we paid for." I leaned against the cool cinder block wall and looked at myself in the small mirror on the plastic table. Simple bun, plain makeup, a dress no one would post to show off. 30 years old and still in their story, the difficult one who chose wrong. My phone lit up beside the scattered bobby pins. A notification from my brokerage app blinked. Portfolio update plus 37,000 today. Under it sat an unread email. Final documents for $5 million literacy fund. Signature required. Out in the hall, I was the broke daughter who worked at a library and a community center because she was too soft for real business. In this cramped back room, I was a woman whose quiet choices now helped run programs across the state. They had never asked enough questions to find that out. The phone buzzed again. A text appeared from a contact saved as Elena R. Landing in Columbus. "Do not start without me. I still owe your mother that promise." My throat tightened. For a moment, I saw my mom in a hospital bed, fingers wrapped around mine, telling me that helping people was not a phase. Linda had been gone for 13 years, but on days like this, she felt closer than the man sitting in the front row. If they recognize her, they will finally understand, I thought. Then another thought followed steadier. I do not owe them understanding. I owe her the truth. Voices from the main hall rose again. Chairs scraped. Someone laughed too loudly. Cassandra's tone turned bright and sweet. "She is 30 and still renting," she told someone. "No real assets. Ethan is just a paramedic. That is not a real career in our circle." Heat rushed up my neck. Ethan, who spent nights in an ambulance so strangers would have a chance to see mourning reduced to a line in her joke. "Did not Linda leave her something?" a woman asked. Cassandra gave a light laugh. "Linda did not understand money," she said. "That is why Mark and I had to fix everything. Honestly, we saved Nora from a poor future." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. They had taken my mother's careful saving, emptied what she left, then told the world they were the ones who rescued me. For a second, I wished I had chosen a courthouse wedding. No guests, no speeches, no thin walls carrying every cruel sentence straight to me. Music started in the hall, my processional song, coming through a portable speaker that crackled at the edges. I could almost feel Cassandra flinch at the sound and the folding chairs and the paper decorations. A car horn sounded outside, then another. Conversation stumbled. Heavy doors slammed shut in quick succession. "Is that a government car?" A man asked, his voice clear in the sudden quiet. "Why is there security here?" Someone shushed him. My heart started to pound so hard it felt like it was in my throat. I set my bouquet down and stepped closer to the door, looking through the narrow gap toward the entrance. The front doors of Riverside Community Center swung open. A woman in a dark tailored suit walked in, steady and composed, with two people at her sides, wearing badges that flashed under the fluorescent lights. The whole room seemed to turn toward her. Voices died mid-sentence. Cassandra's smile froze. My father stared unblinking. For once, nobody had anything to say. Hidden just behind the side door in my simple rented dress and budget makeup, I closed my eyes for a beat and let the silence wash over me. "Mom," I whispered just loud enough for the wall to hear. "If you can see this, I kept your promise. And tonight they finally get to live with the truth they bought." I grew up in a small brown house on the east side of Columbus, the kind of place where the walls held more memories than paint, where my mother, Linda Lane, came home smelling faintly of antiseptic and laundry detergent because she worked double shifts at the community hospital, and even when she was exhausted, she always found a way to sit with me at the kitchen table and look over the small stack of envelopes where she kept every bill, every receipt, every dollar she tried to save for my future, and she would tap the paper with her fingertip and say, "This is not much, but it is yours, college, or a house deposit someday. No one touches this without you." And I believed her because she had never once broken a promise, not even the small ones. When I was 14, she started coughing first, small and dry, then deep and painful, and I remember watching her lean over the sink, gripping the counter as if the house itself was slipping away from her. And after a few weeks, she came home from work with an envelope she did not open until after dinner. And when she finally unfolded the papers, her hand trembled, and she said quietly that the tests were back, and she would need more scans. And though she tried to make her voice steady, I could hear the fear trying to push through every word. The diagnosis came fast, stage 4, too fast for us to process, and Dad began talking about medical bills and payment plans and second mortgages, his voice always rising, always frantic, while Mom simply sat on the couch with her blanket pulled around her shoulders and asked him to calm down, reminding him that she had bought a life insurance plan and that the little savings they had set aside for me should not be touched. Though she never said it harshly, only gently, because she did not want to leave the world with any sharp edges. She fought for almost 3 years and still found ways to keep adding $20 here or $50 there to the account marked Nora's Future. And even when she could barely stand, she pulled me close one night and whispered, "If anything happens, that money is yours for your education, for your first home. Do not let anyone tell you different." She was gone by the time I turned 17, and the funeral was small and quiet. No stepmother yet, no new relatives in expensive clothes, just a few nurses from her ward, 2 neighbors, one of my teachers and Dad who looked lost and angry at the same time as the pastor spoke. After the burial, he met with the lawyer, and the papers were read so quickly it felt like a formality, a checklist rather than a farewell, and though the accounts were modest, they were supposed to be protected from me, held by Dad because I was still a minor, not because they were his. For a few months, everything stayed still heavy, like someone had put the whole house under water. And then one evening in early spring, Dad came home with a woman he introduced as Cassandra, a widow in her early 40s with glossy hair and a perfume that filled the hallway. And I remember standing at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing because something in my stomach twisted in a way I could not explain. Cassandra moved into our lives quickly. Too quickly, her clothes hanging in Mom's old closet, her laughter echoing off the kitchen tiles as if she was trying to rewrite the acoustics of the house. And Dad seemed relieved by her confidence, her certainty, her way of explaining everything as if she had a rule book for life that Mom had never been given. One night, a few weeks after she arrived, I came downstairs for water and heard them talking in the living room. The lamps turned low, their silhouettes stretched across the walls, and Cassandra was holding a file with the familiar color of bank documents, while telling Dad that it was not healthy for me to cling to Linda's old accounts, that he and I both needed a fresh start, that joining all the money into a single new account would allow them to invest more wisely and grow it for the future, and Dad nodded slowly, tired, overwhelmed, signing papers without hesitating. I stood on the stairs, unable to breathe properly, not understanding every detail, but understanding enough to know that something precious was being moved out of my reach. Within a few months, the house where Mom had marked my height on the door frame was listed for sale, then sold, and I watched strangers repaint the living room through the window as Dad signed paperwork on the porch, and Cassandra praised the decision, saying this is what real planning looks like, as if everything Mom had done before was foolish or backward. We moved into a bigger suburban home with granite countertops, a koi pond in the backyard, and a mortgage that stretched across 2 decades. And while Cassandra arranged throw pillows and organized dinner parties, I wandered through the hallways feeling like a ghost in a place not meant for me. Every time I asked about Mom's savings or the money she left for my education, Dad dismissed me with a quick, "We are handling it," or "It is in a better place now," and Cassandra would smile in a way that made me feel small, like I was the child who did not understand how grown-ups managed finances, as if my mother's intentions could be overwritten simply by their convenience. The first seed of injustice was planted there in that bright, polished house that smelled like citrus candles and fresh paint, where everything new had been built on something old that no one wanted to acknowledge. I did not have the language for it then, but I knew one thing with a clarity that scared me. My mother's money, my mother's house, my mother's legacy had been swallowed whole by a life she never asked for, wrapped in the polite excuse of smart planning and a fresh start, and I was expected to smile and accept it because I was too young to fight and too alone to be heard. I started college believing my mother had already paved the road for me, believing her careful savings and the life insurance she fought so hard to maintain through her illness would carry me through Ohio State without forcing me to drown in loans, and during my first year I did not question anything because every tuition payment went through smoothly, and I thought maybe Dad had finally honored something she left behind. Maybe the new house and the new life with Cassandra had not erased everything that mattered. By the fall of my sophomore year in 2013, I walked into the financial aid office with the same quiet confidence Mom had given me, holding my student ID in one hand and a folder in the other. And when the administrator typed my name into the system, she frowned, then tried again before looking up and saying, "The family contribution account has insufficient funds. The balance is 0. And for a moment, the room tilted because it felt impossible that the money Mom protected with her last strength could simply vanish. I asked for a printed statement, and the woman hesitated as if she expected me to get angry or cry right there. But she handed me the papers, and I stepped outside into the cold air where students hurried past with coffees and backpacks and plans I suddenly felt I did not belong to anymore. And when I finally unfolded the papers, my hands shook because there it was, in plain text. The account labeled Linda Savings had been emptied more than a year earlier, and the withdrawal had been transferred directly into the joint account of Mark Lane and Cassandra Lane, a line so clean and final it felt like someone wiping chalk off a board. I went home that evening rehearsing what I would say, hoping Dad would have an explanation. I had not considered maybe a bill I did not know about, maybe a mistake he could fix. But when I placed the papers on the kitchen counter, he barely skimmed them before rubbing the back of his neck, and Cassandra stepped in with the ease of someone who had practiced this for months, telling me they had to move things around because of adult responsibilities, like medical bills and the mortgage. And that, I was old enough to understand that life was complicated. I told her Mom had said that money was for my education for my first home, that no one was supposed to touch it. And Cassandra let out a small laugh, the kind that carried more dismissal than humor, and said, "Your mother meant well, but she was not good with money. We are. And you can take loans like everyone else. It builds character." Dad stared at the floor while she spoke, as if her words were his shield. I felt something inside me crack not loudly but sharply like the first break in thin ice, and I realized the money was gone, long before they admitted anything spent or absorbed into their new life without a second thought. I took out loans for the semester and worked extra shifts, tutoring, telling myself I could get through school on my own strength, but the truth of what they had done hovered over me like a shadow. In the spring, Dad held a birthday gathering at the new house, the lake house friends visiting the expensive wine on the counter, everything gleaming as if polished to reflect their curated success. And during the party, I walked into the living room just as Cassandra said loudly enough for the entire circle to hear that Nora is insisting we pay for everything, like some spoiled teenager. And then she added, almost cheerfully, "We already gave her so much. Mark sacrificed his retirement for that girl." And the room turned toward me with a mix of pity and annoyance, as if I were a burden no one wanted to claim. They had used Mom's money for the down payment for the renovation, for the vacations they took to reset, from the stress of blending families. And now they stood in the middle of it all pretending they had carried me for years, while I was the one carrying the weight of the truth. I felt my face heat, but I said nothing because I knew they would twist any defense into proof that I was ungrateful. Later that week, I found a receipt on the counter for an $8,000 dining set, purchased the same month the Linda savings account had been emptied, and a glossy brochure from a resort they had visited around the same time. And the puzzle snapped together so quickly, I had to sit down, realizing my college fund had become furniture and vacation cocktails, realizing they had spent what Mom saved for me on the exact lifestyle Mom never chased for herself. At dinner a few nights later, Cassandra proudly ran her hand along the edge of the new table, saying it was real hardwood that they invested in quality, expecting admiration, and something in me hardened. I smiled lightly and said it is beautiful. Mom would have loved to see what her college fund bought, and the moment hung in the air like a dropped glass hovering before it shatters the entire table, falling silent as Cassandra swallowed hard and Dad wiped his palms on his napkin. They did not answer because there was nothing they could say without admitting what they had done. And for the first time in years, I watched Cassandra lose her composure, even briefly, as if she finally realized I was not the quiet girl who would let them shape the story unchallenged. It was not revenge, not the kind people cheer for, but it was real, a small, sharp truth, slipping out between fork and plate. The kind of moment women my age and older know too well when the person who wronged you is forced to sit with your words and cannot twist them into something else. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how easily they had rewritten my mother's sacrifice, how Cassandra had woven a narrative where she was the financial savior while Mom was the foolish nurse who did not understand money, and I understood with painful clarity that I was not part of their family image. I was a footnote in a story they preferred to tell about themselves. Something changed in me, then not loud or dramatic, but steady, a promise that if they wanted me to play the outsider, they would soon learn I was far more capable on my own than they had ever imagined, and that the version of me they dismissed at that table would not be the version they faced forever. I was 21 when the line between their world and mine finally became clear, when the quiet divide that had started with a bank transfer and a new dining table turned into a separation between the $2 million family image Cassandra curated and the girl she kept at the edges for when a daughter-shaped prop looked useful. And by then I could read the coded phrases she used almost as easily as the spine labels on the books I shelved at the library. She loved to talk in numbers, not the way my mother had talked about saving a little for something solid, but like she was announcing scores our home appraised over $2 million this year. Our circle is used to a certain standard, and whenever I was in the room, she would lift her glass and add, "Except for Nora, she has chosen the simple life, turning my existence into a joke that made her shine brighter." I worked at a small branch library on the east side, a building with worn carpet and humming lights and kids drifting in after school, because we had computers and warmth and someone who would explain homework twice. And some evenings I walked down to Riverside Community Center to run reading circles, giving my time to the kind of place Cassandra dismissed with a raised eyebrow. Yet whenever her friends needed proof that Mark was a devoted father, she would invite me to the lake house, and I would stand on their deck feeling like an extra who had wandered into the wrong scene. That house on the water was her stage, a deck facing the lake, a shiny boat at the dock, neighbors arriving with salads and bottles, and at a barbecue. In the summer of 2016, I stood near the grill with a paper plate while Cassandra floated between guests in a dress that probably cost more than my rent, talking about renovation budgets and club dues. And when she finally gestured toward me, she said, "This is Nora. She works at a little library. She likes the simple life, letting the pause hang long enough for everyone to understand that simple meant less, meant not like us." They smiled politely and turned back to their conversations, and I felt myself shrink to fit the outline she traced for me: poor, harmless, safely forgettable. Back at the library, the air felt easier to breathe, and it was there that I met Jonah, a volunteer who came in on Saturdays to help with a small tech project for our adult literacy program. A lanky guy with a sticker-covered laptop and a habit of tapping the table when he thought through a problem, and he was building an application that would let adults practice reading on donated tablets without needing the internet's simple screens and large letters. I watched him work with one of our regulars, a man in his 50s, who was learning to read so he could help his granddaughter, and I saw how the tablet gave him privacy a worksheet could not. And afterward, I told Jonah that if he wanted real stories about what our students faced, I had plenty. Our check-ins turned into longer talks about how many adults still struggled with basic reading, about how most tools were built for classrooms and not for people who work shifts and squeeze study time into 20 quiet minutes at night. And one afternoon, when the building was almost empty, he leaned back and said, "If this works in more than one place, someone will eventually want to buy it," saying it so calmly that for a second I could see it. Our little pilot stretching across more towns, though I laughed and told him I was just trying to keep my Tuesday group funded. His sentence settled next to my mother's old promise, a second quiet seed I carried back into the polished world Cassandra guarded. By 2017, she had perfected her status performance. She talked about the lake house, like a brand mentioned their club membership as if it were a title teased my thrift store clothes in front of guests with a smile that pretended it was a joke. And every time she narrated our lives, she placed herself and my father on one side of an invisible line and left me on the other, allowed in, only when she needed me for symmetry in a photograph. The clearest cut came later that year, when they hosted a housewarming party to show off a new addition to the lake house, a glassy room facing the water, and they hired a photographer and invited a lifestyle blog that liked to feature aspirational homes. I heard nothing about it until a coworker at the library pulled out her phone during our break and asked, "Is this your dad?" And there on the screen was my father on the deck, with Cassandra at his side, friends arranged around them, the caption, reading, "Our family, finally complete." I scrolled through photo after photo, the living room with the expensive table that used to be my tuition, the boat, the dock, smiling faces in careful clusters, and my own face was nowhere. The article quoted Cassandra talking about creating a haven where family would always feel welcome, and sitting in the staff room with my lunch going cold, I understood that she had not only pushed me to the margins, she had erased me from the stories she told the world. That night, I went home and opened my social media, blocked her from seeing anything I posted, then created a second account I used only to glance at her public posts when I needed to remember how far she was willing to go to protect her version of reality. And each time I saw another picture of the lake or the club, I felt that familiar twist in my chest. But underneath it, something else was growing, a decision that I would never again look to them for support. Instead, I took that sting back to the library, back to Jonah and the app, and the grant forms on a plastic table, and I poured myself into the work we were doing, into drafting lesson paths that would fit real lives into calls with a community center 2 towns over that wanted to try the program into building something that did not require Cassandra's approval or my father's signature. Being left out of their glossy housewarming spread hurt in a way I still struggle to describe. Because it was not just about a party, it was about seeing in print the version of family where I had already been declared unnecessary, but it also drew a line I knew they would not be able to redraw later, because when the woman they called poor and simple finally stepped into the light of what she had built, they would not be able to edit themselves into that picture without everyone noticing the lie. And even though I did not yet know exactly how that moment would arrive, I knew enough to keep moving forward without them. By the time I turned 24, the version of me Cassandra kept presenting to the world had grown smaller and flatter with every passing year, until I sometimes felt like a silhouette, a thin paper outline she held up to convince guests that I was harmless, unambitious, and content with the crumbs of their $2 million life. Yet the truth was unfolding quietly in the spaces. She never bothered to look in the evenings at the library when the building hummed with the soft noise of turning pages and whispered questions in the hours after closing, when I walked down to Riverside Community Center, carrying stacks of reading guides and dog-eared lesson plans, and in the growing partnership between me and Jonah that nobody outside our program cared to notice. I became full-time at the library in early 2018, taking on more responsibilities running reading circles, designing curriculum for adults who were embarrassed to admit they struggled, and on weekends, Jonah and I sat at a plastic table with 2 laptops, shaping an idea that felt too big for the worn carpeting beneath our feet, a literacy application that could work without internet and adjust itself to the pace of learners who had been left behind for decades. We named the project Clear Path Literacy because we wanted people to feel they had a road forward, not just worksheets that made them feel slow. And when we signed the paperwork that made me a silent co-founder, I told Jonah I had nothing to bring except stories from the field and a network of teachers who trusted me. And he told me that was worth more than the code itself, because without it, the app would be just screens instead of something rooted in real lives. We applied for small grants, the kind that made your hands shake when you hit submit, because $5,000 could keep a program alive for months, and slowly libraries in nearby towns began agreeing to pilot ClearPath, responding to emails I sent late at night after shelving books all day. Meanwhile, Cassandra maintained her routine of belittling my work with comments she delivered like gentle scolding, telling me you are almost 30 and still shelving books, Nora. When will you get a real career, stirring her wine while Dad nodded, as if her version of adulthood were the standard I kept failing. I answered simply, I like what I do, because explaining anything more would open the door for her to twist it into another lecture about real ambition. And besides, there was a small thrill in knowing that while she pictured me as a perpetually underpaid book clerk, I was quietly building something that might one day change the trajectory of people who had been invisible their whole lives, and that one day she would have no vocabulary left to diminish it. The turning point arrived in early 2021 when a national ed tech fund reached out after hearing about the pilot from one of the libraries, asking if we would consider a conversation about potential acquisition. And for weeks, Jonah and I met with lawyers and advisors, learning a new language of valuation and equity and due diligence, while I still spent my mornings helping a young mother apply for her first library card. The day Jonah told me they had settled on a $12 million valuation, I sat down on the curb outside the center because my legs stopped cooperating, and he said, "Your share is a little over $3 million. Before taxes delivered so gently, you would think he was telling me about a shift in the weather, and I felt like the entire world tilted, not because of the money itself, but because of what it meant for the future I had carried since Mom's last hospital bed confession. The acquisition required me to stay on as the face of the program in Ohio, to run pilots and work directly with the Literacy Fund, which felt like another quiet victory, a way to stay rooted in the places that had raised me while stepping into a bigger orbit. I signed the contract, thanked Jonah for believing in me, and then kept the entire development to myself, because I knew that if I told Mark and Cassandra, they would rewrite the story into something they had created, something they had funded or guided, and the truth was they had done nothing but drain what my mother had left to me. When the funds arrived, I opened an LLC under the name L&N Community Holdings, the L for Linda and the N for the girl she believed in, and I researched investments late into the night, purchasing a small apartment intended for rental income, placing money in index funds and bonds like the financial advisors recommended, and then focusing on the project that meant more to me than any of it. The community center that had carried so many families through crises and was now at risk of being sold. The building was under financial strain, and a buyer had already expressed interest in turning it into a private event space, something that would have erased the reading circles, the free dinners, the after-school tutoring, and the small rooms where I first met adults who had been told they would never learn to read. When I spoke to the owner, he said he wanted the building to remain a place for the community, but the numbers no longer worked, and I told him quietly that I had an idea paying the deposit through the LLC without adding my name to anything public, because I wanted the center to stand on its own, not as a trophy for Cassandra to point at in another conversation about appearances. In the middle of all of this, there was a dinner with my father and stepmother at a restaurant near the lake, a place with dim lights and crisp linens, and Cassandra did her usual routine of asking loudly if the library had given me a raise yet, or if I was still earning what she called goodwill checks, and when the server brought the bill, she reached for it with her practiced grace, announcing, "I will get this one." Because Mark and I believe in supporting the next generation, a line meant to impress the couple dining nearby. Before she could hand over her card, I walked to the counter, and paid the entire bill with my own card, the one tied to an account she did not know existed, and when the server returned, he said, "It has already been taken care of, ma'am." And Cassandra blinked, forcing a smile as she said, "Oh, really? Who did that?" And I returned to my seat saying, "Sometimes even library girls have good days," watching her face tighten for a split second before she composed herself. It was petty, almost childish, but incredibly satisfying, a small reclaiming of dignity in a world where she had treated me like a burden for so many years. And in that moment, I could feel a shift, a glimpse of the power she would never understand until it stood in front of her with lights and witnesses. The truth was that by the time I turned 28, I was a quiet millionaire, my net worth hovering around $3 million. Yet I still wore the same comfortable shoes, still spent my afternoons reading with seniors, still kept my mother's memory close by, doing the work she always admired, and I did it all without letting my father or Cassandra see even a sliver of what I was building. Because the reckoning that was coming for them had to be earned moment by moment, and I wanted them to walk into it fully unaware that the version of me they dismissed was already far beyond their reach. By the end of 2023, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt gentle and earned the kind of steadiness I had once watched from afar in other families. And when Ethan proposed in the parking lot behind the hospital after a double shift, holding a small ring he had saved for over months, the ring not flashy but warm and steady. Like the way he showed up for people on their worst days, I felt something in me open in a way I had spent years trying to protect, and I said yes as the cold air fogged around us and an ambulance rolled by with its lights muted. We sat in his car afterward, eating fast food and laughing at how unromantic it all looked. Yet it felt more genuine than any country club proposal I had seen online. And when we talked about the wedding, I told him I wanted Riverside Community Center, the place where I taught adults to read, the place where ClearPath had first taken shape on folding tables, the place that had held me through the years Cassandra spent shutting doors, the place I was now quietly on the verge of buying through L&N Community Holdings. Ethan said it sounded perfect, and that he wanted a wedding that felt like us, not something curated for a crowd that had never cared to know who we were, and I felt joy rise so quickly it almost hurt. A week later, I invited Dad and Cassandra to dinner at a modest restaurant near my apartment, hoping that sharing the news early might soften them, hoping that maybe my father would see this as a chance to be present in a way he had not managed in years. But as soon as I said we wanted a small wedding at Riverside, a simple community-focused ceremony, Cassandra let out a short laugh, not loud but sharp enough to cut through whatever hope I had carried. She said, "You are 30. Nora, most women your age have real weddings, not potluck receptions in a gym." And she lifted her menu with one hand while tapping her manicured nails on the table, as if the conversation bored her. Dad stared at the wine list, unable to meet my eyes, and for a second I wondered if he remembered that Mom had volunteered at Riverside, that she had dreamed of programs that would lift families who never stepped foot in places Cassandra considered acceptable. Cassandra leaned forward with her practiced air of authority and presented what she called a solution, saying that to protect our family's reputation, she and Dad could pay for a country club wedding invite, their friends coordinate decor with a planner she knew, and create something elegant enough to reflect who we are. I asked what she meant by who we are, and she explained it like she was describing a simple fact, saying that I was part of a family with a $2 million lifestyle, and it would look strange if my wedding did not reflect that, then added the condition that Ethan would need to sign a prenuptial drafted by her attorney to ensure financial clarity. She continued by listing guests. She would add speeches, she would approve, seating, she would assign, talking as if my own wedding were a promotional event for her social circle. The words felt oily sliding between us with the subtle message that my life would be presentable only if she controlled every inch of it. I looked at Dad hoping he would interrupt her, say something, anything, but he only pressed his lips together and the silence tasted like resignation. I finally said, "I am not trading my mother's memory or my work for your photo backdrop," and Cassandra's smile froze before thinning into something sharp. She turned to Dad and said, "If she insists on marrying in that cheap center, then we should stay home or sit in the back and pretend we hardly know her," and her voice was light as if she were discussing the weather. Dad murmured her name, trying weakly to soften her words, but then his shoulders dropped, his eyes shutting for a moment before he exhaled and said, "I will not pay for a wedding that makes us look poor." I felt the air leave my chest as if I had been hit, not because I needed his money, but because this was the man who had carried me on his shoulders when I was small, who used to brag about my grades before Cassandra rewrote what pride was allowed to look like. That night, after we parted in awkward tension, I received a text from him, simple and cold, saying, "We will not be contributing financially, and I do not feel comfortable walking you down that aisle, not like this." I stared at the words until they blurred the familiar ache spreading through my ribs, the ache of being chosen second to money, once again chosen second to an image, chosen second to a woman who had spent a decade erasing Mom's memory and repainting our family into something unrecognizable. When I told Ethan, I felt something crumble in my voice, and I said, "Maybe we should just go to the courthouse. No one needs to see us. No one needs to be disappointed." And he pulled me close and said, "They chose their money. We get to choose our piece, and you still have more power than you think." I wanted to believe him, but part of me had become the 17-year-old girl holding a stack of bank statements she did not understand, the 19-year-old being mocked at a birthday party, the 22-year-old cropped out of a family photo, and in that moment the idea of standing alone at the aisle felt unbearable. I lay awake that night thinking about how universal this pain is. How many women go through their weddings, grieving the father they lost long before the ceremony? How many daughters watch a man pick pride or a second wife or a bank account instead of them? And for the first time since childhood, I let myself admit that Dad had been choosing Cassandra's comfort over my mother's memory for years. By morning, the numbness settled into something quieter, but solid, a weight in my stomach that made everything sharper, and as I sat in the small kitchen of my apartment, I realized that this was the darkest stretch of the tunnel, a place where forward felt uncertain and backward felt impossible, but also a place I had learned to climb out of before. Ethan kissed my forehead before leaving for his shift and said, "We will make this ours, not theirs." And I nodded, even though part of me still felt like a child staring at a closed door. Later that day, I opened my laptop and looked at the files for the Riverside purchase, the paperwork that would finalize the sale under L&N Holdings, and I felt something stir, a reminder that I had already built a life Cassandra could not control, a life Dad could not shrink, and that this devastation was only the middle of the story, not the ending they thought they had written for me. In the months leading up to the wedding, while Cassandra spent her days ranting to friends about how embarrassing it was that I insisted on a ceremony in a community center, I spent my evenings finalizing documents that would secure that very building for the next decade, papers filed under L&N Community Holdings, a name she would never recognize, but one that carried the initials of the woman who raised me and the girl she protected with her last breath. The owner of Riverside had been searching for a buyer because years of budget cuts and maintenance problems had drained every reserve, and small groups that relied on the building were terrified of losing their meeting rooms, their after-school programs, their sense of place. So when I approached him quietly and said I wanted it to remain a home for the neighborhood, he looked at me with the kind of relief that softens a person's face, and he explained how he had turned down offers from developers even though he needed the money because he could not bear to see the classrooms gutted for private events. I told him I wanted the building for the same reason he wanted to keep it alive, and when he asked if an investor was backing me, I nodded, knowing my mother would have understood that the truth and the details were not always the same. By the time the purchase agreement was signed, I had transferred a large portion of my ClearPath earnings into the holding company, reminding myself that money meant nothing unless it made someone else's life better, and I requested only one condition: that the center continue functioning as a non-profit community space, and that my involvement remain anonymous. Outwardly, I still looked like the coordinator who planned reading circles and literacy nights, but on paper, I was the chairwoman and benefactor of the building that had raised me the one place Cassandra could never take from me. Around the same time, the organization that had acquired ClearPath reached out with a proposal to create a long-term literacy fund named in honor of my mother, a fund that would allocate $5 million over 10 years and serve as a model for statewide community partnerships. And when they asked where the headquarters should be, I immediately said Riverside because it had always been more than walls and folding chairs. It had been the first room where an adult learner spelled his granddaughter's name correctly for the first time, the first place where a single mother cried after reading a full page on her own, the place where a version of my life began again. The fund's advisors wanted a launch date that carried symbolic weight, suggesting an education conference or a philanthropy gala. But the thought made my stomach turn because those spaces belonged to people like Cassandra, people who valued chandeliers over change, and when they asked if I had other ideas, I paused before saying my wedding day might be the most meaningful place for something new to begin. They were quiet for a moment, and then agreed, offering to send representatives and even a small media team. If I was comfortable, though, they stressed that the story would be framed around community impact rather than personal wealth, a detail that eased my nerves. Only one person outside of my fiancé knew the full picture of what I was building, and that was Elena Ruiz, the Education Philanthropy Director who had been on the committee that reviewed ClearPath's acquisition and who had followed my career with a kind of mentorship I had never known from anyone in my own family. Elena first visited the center on a gray January morning, stepping inside with a scarf still wrapped around her neck. And when I showed her the upstairs room where I used to run reading drills, she listened with genuine interest, not performative curiosity, and she said quietly that I had done something extraordinary with extraordinarily little. When we sat down later with tea and paper cups, she asked, "Does your family know any of this?" And I let out a small breath before saying, "They only know I work at the library. That is all they ever wanted to hear." Elena pressed her lips together in a way that told me she understood the deeper meaning without needing it explained, and she asked if I would be comfortable with her speaking at the wedding not as a commissioner but as the woman who had watched me grow an idea into a lifeline for thousands. I told her I was honored, and she said, "Then let me help you show people who you truly are, because you have spent enough years shrinking for people who never wanted to see you." Meanwhile, Cassandra was living in her own private storm because the country club she adored had recently sent out a notice informing preferred members that the sponsorship program would be shifting its funds away from private banquets and toward community literacy initiatives, and she read the email 3 times before complaining loudly at dinner that it was ridiculous for the club to cut their preferred rates. She said it with the same indignation she used whenever she discovered a wrinkle in her curated world, and I stirred my coffee knowing that the policy change had crossed my desk weeks before knowing that my signature was printed on internal documents redirecting money exactly where my mother would have wanted it to go, and the irony made me swallow a laugh. Cassandra sighed dramatically, saying the club should know its priorities, and I nodded lightly, as if I had no idea why the shift had happened, letting her stew in the inconvenience of a world no longer designed for her applause. The more the weeks passed, the more I understood the scope of what I was building, not just a secret net worth or an investment portfolio, but a quiet redistribution of power, shaping a future where people like Cassandra were no longer the only ones whose decisions mattered. My father still believed I would walk down the aisle as the librarian daughter with a modest paycheck, and Cassandra still described me to friends as someone who had settled for less yet. The truth was that while they spent years trying to climb toward a life they thought signaled importance, I had been slowly creating something that actually changed lives, and every step brought me closer to a moment they would never see coming. I kept my head down at family dinners, answering questions with polite short sentences, pretending to be smaller than I was until the right moment, because sometimes staying quiet was not weakness, but preparation, and I knew that the reveal would land harder, precisely because they had written me off entirely. I began mapping the wedding plans with Ethan, making sure every detail of the community ceremony aligned with the fund launch, coordinating times with the literacy advisors, and the media team arranging seating so that the people who had shaped my actual life would be closest to the center, and letting Cassandra believe she was punishing me by refusing to help. 18 days before the wedding, I stood in the main hall of Riverside looking at the scuffed floors and simple lights, the kind of space my stepmother mocked without mercy. And I felt an unexpected swell of gratitude that this would be the place where everything converged. The past I had survived, the present I had built, and the future my family did not yet know they were about to meet. On the morning of the wedding, the air inside Riverside felt soft and warm from the strings of lights Ethan and I had hung the night before. Little amber bulbs tracing the beams and giving the room a glow that reminded me of the evenings when my mother and I read together at the kitchen table. Yet before I could let that comfort settle, Cassandra swept through the front entrance with the sound of expensive heels tapping on the old floor. Her perfume sharp enough to announce her presence before she even spoke, and when she finally opened her mouth, the first words she released were an exaggerated sigh as she looked around the hall and said, "Smells like a school cafeteria," as if the walls had personally offended her. She wore a dress that belonged on the cover of a fashion magazine, a purse with a gold emblem held out just far enough to be noticed, and she slowly rotated her body like she expected cameras to flash, muttering about lighting and angles while ignoring the handmade centerpieces and little details I had prepared with friends from the literacy program who had stayed past midnight, helping me tie ribbons and wipe down tables because they believed in what this day represented. She stepped closer to the decorations and flicked one of the candles with a manicured finger, whispering a disappointed, "Oh dear," under her breath, then turned to a pair of distant cousins she'd invited only out of obligation and slipped white envelopes into their hands while saying, "This is for Saturday, the real event. Make sure you come dressed appropriately, because that is the celebration that actually matters." Her voice was sugar-coated but sharp in the way only wealthy women with something to prove could manage, and the cousins nodded awkwardly, glancing around as if unsure whether they were allowed to enjoy the room they were standing in. My father arrived shortly after, straightening the collar of his suit, avoiding my eyes as he walked past the first row of chairs, choosing to sit in the third row without hesitation. And when one of the ushers gently suggested he could sit up front, he waved the idea off by saying he did not want to get in the way of the ceremony, though the truth hung in the air without needing to be spoken, that he did not want to be photographed front and center in a place he saw as beneath him. I felt my stomach tighten as I watched him settle into his seat, and part of me wondered whether he would have sat even farther back if Cassandra had asked him to. Close by, one of Cassandra's friends snapped a photo of the hall with her phone laughing as she said, "At least it will make a funny story, your stepdaughter's little charity wedding." And Cassandra let out a soft chuckle while replying, "She wanted to show the world she does not need our money." Now she gets to enjoy the view. The comment landed like a cold wind cutting through the room, and I stood just behind the partially closed side door, hearing every word pressing my hand to my chest to steady my breathing, because even after everything they had taken from me, I still felt a sting that surprised me, yet I also felt something else rising beneath it. Not anger exactly, but an awareness that they were about to collide headfirst with a truth they had spent years refusing to imagine. A few volunteers adjusted the final table cards, unaware of the shift in the atmosphere, and then without warning, a low hum echoed outside the sound of engines in a small caravan rolling into the parking lot, followed by the clipped voices of event security, doing quick checks. Murmurs spread through the guests like ripples from a dropped stone, because no one expected any kind of official convoy at a community center wedding, and several people craned their necks toward the entrance as staff members in discreet black attire stepped in to coordinate timing with the ceremony team. The double doors opened fully as Elena Ruiz walked in. First, her posture. Calm and composed her suit, a simple dark shade that contrasted beautifully with the soft lights of the hall. And behind her came two directors from the National Literacy Partnership, a deputy from the State Education Board, and a pair of representatives from the philanthropic division of the organization that had acquired ClearPath, their badges discreet but unmistakable to anyone who followed state or regional education affairs. A small media team entered as well, cameras in hand, moving with quiet respect as they checked angles and lighting, clearly used to filming moments that marked the beginning of long-term initiatives. Conversations halted instantly, every whispered joke and muttered criticism dying in midair as guests tried to make sense of who these people were and why they were walking into a wedding that Cassandra had declared too cheap for family photos. Cassandra herself froze for a second, blinking as if her eyes were playing tricks on her, then straightened her shoulders and attempted a smile, assuming they must have come to speak with her, or perhaps to congratulate her on supporting some charitable cause. Yet the moment Elena spotted me near the side hallway, she walked directly toward me with a warm, genuine smile that softened everything inside me, and she said, "Are you ready, Nora? Your mother would be so proud loud enough for several rows of guests to hear." I nodded as a wave of silence swept across the room, because for the first time, many of these people were realizing that the officials and philanthropists gathering in the hall had not come by accident. They had come with purpose, and it was not Cassandra's. While Cassandra adjusted her necklace like she expected to be introduced, any second one of the literacy directors approached her politely and asked if she could step aside so they could prepare to meet the bride, and the way Cassandra's face faltered for a moment was almost imperceptible, but not invisible. The irony hung thick in the air, almost tangible, because minutes earlier she had reduced the wedding to a charity-themed embarrassment. Yet now, the highest-ranking figures in statewide philanthropy were taking their seats with a level of respect she could never buy, not with any of the money she flaunted or borrowed or absorbed from someone else's loss. My father watched it all unfold, with an expression I could not read entirely, a mix of confusion and something that looked like fear, his fingers twitching against the armrest as though he might stand but then thinking better of it. And in that moment, I realized the shift had already begun. The tables turning slowly but unmistakably, and all I needed to do was walk through the doorway and let the truth finish its work. When the music began and the guests rose from their chairs, I felt my breath catch for a moment because for the first time since childhood, I was walking into a room where my mother's memory and my own work were finally allowed to exist without apology. Yet there was still an ache as I stepped forward alone, the empty space beside me, the shape of every promise my father had once made, and then quietly abandoned, and the silence that filled the hall as people realized no one was escorting me was thick enough to feel like a second skin. I took one more step, and then Elena Ruiz stood from the front row, her movements calm and deliberate, and she walked toward me with a gentle expression that held both admiration and something almost protective, extending her hand as she said, "If you do not mind, I would be honored to walk you down the aisle." I nodded, trying not to let emotion swallow my voice, and the guests whispered, "Isn't that the commissioner? Is she really here for her?" And the murmur grew as Elena placed my hand on her arm, guiding me down the aisle with a steadiness no one in my blood family had ever offered me. My father watched from the third row shoulders, stiff, his eyes darting between Elena and me, as if trying to make sense of the scene unfolding in front of him, while Cassandra pressed her lips together so tightly the color drained from them, clutching her designer purse like a life raft in a room she no longer controlled. The ceremony itself moved with an unexpected softness, the vows spoken under the warm community center lights, the air charged with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. And when the officiant declared us married, the applause rose like a tide, sincere and full, and I could almost imagine my mother somewhere in that sound. After the vows, Elena stepped forward again and requested the microphone, her presence steadying the room as she waited for the last whispers to fade. She began by telling a story, her voice clear and warm, speaking of a young woman who worked at a small library and taught reading classes right here at Riverside. A young woman who noticed long before anyone else that the center was close to being sold because the budget cuts had pushed it to the edge. A young woman who refused to let that happen. Elena explained how that woman had written proposals alone at her kitchen table called Organizations That Barely Knew Her Name, convinced a national foundation to take a chance on a literacy program, and eventually used part of her own earnings from a startup deal to keep this building open for the people who needed it most. Then she lifted her hand and gestured around the room slowly as she said, "This place, you are standing in this cheap place," as someone called it. She owns it through her foundation. She bought it so children and adults, like she once was, would not lose the safe space that shaped her life. A visible ripple moved through the guests, some turning to look at the walls, as if seeing them for the first time, others glancing directly at Cassandra, whose face drained of color, as though every drop of superiority had been pulled from her at once, while my father sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, except for the slight tightening of his jaw. I could feel heat rise to my cheeks as applause started again this time, louder, sharper, carrying the kind of respect I had once begged silently for, but never expected to receive, and the sound traveled all the way to the hallway where volunteers and media teams stood filming. Elena waited for the applause to settle, and then continued by saying, "Tonight we are also honored to announce the official launch of the Linda Lane Literacy Fund, named for a woman whose quiet strength shaped her daughter into the leader she is, and over the next 10 years, at least $5 million will support programs run from right here in this community center, funded by partnerships that began because of one woman's persistence." Cameras flashed as a screen lit up behind her, displaying the fund's name in large letters and my name beneath it. And when the banner expanded to show the projected 10-year timeline, the hall filled with soft gasps. A representative from the education tech company that had acquired ClearPath walked up next, giving a short speech about how the platform I helped build had been adopted across multiple states, changing literacy outcomes for adult learners. And then he added, "She never talks about what she earned from the acquisition because she chose to reinvest most of her payout into communities like this one, and we think that should be honored tonight." Heads turned instinctively toward Cassandra, whose image of herself as the standard of wealth suddenly seemed fragile and absurd, especially when another guest whispered to her friend, "So the cheap girl is actually the millionaire here." I could not tell whether that whisper was meant for me to hear or whether it existed only to validate what the entire room now understood. But either way, the truth settled like a spotlight on the people who had spent years mocking me. My father finally blinked his face, paling as though the floor beneath him had shifted, the realization sinking in that the daughter he had dismissed had been quietly building something far more valuable than his lake house and far more real than any of Cassandra's curated lifestyle photos. I stood near the front with Ethan holding my hand, feeling a strange blend of vindication and peace wash over me, because this was not about humiliating them. This was about revealing what had always existed beneath their assumptions, and the room now saw the full shape of my life without the shadows they tried to cast over it. The applause rose again, the kind that vibrated across the floorboards, the kind that reached the back rows where Cassandra sat, frozen, unable to stitch her dignity back together fast enough. It was the moment the entire revenge roller coaster had been building toward a public exposure rooted not in cruelty, but in truth. And as I looked at the faces before me, I understood that every humiliation, every theft, every insult had led to this exact point, where my mother's legacy was shining brighter than any lake house chandelier Cassandra had ever flaunted. The reception moved into its warm, late-evening rhythm with soft music and the hum of conversations rising and falling like gentle waves, and I felt myself finally exhaling after the whirlwind of revelations that had filled the ceremony. Yet even in that brief peace, I could sense Cassandra circling the room with the brittle smile of someone desperate to reclaim even a fragment of the status she had just lost. She eventually approached Elena with a shaky confidence, adjusting her bracelet as if the shine could distract from the truth everyone had witnessed. And she said, "We have always supported Nora's little projects," her tone sugary enough to fool someone who had never read a grant file in their life. But Elena met her with a polite nod that carried a coolness so sharp it could cut glass, as she replied, "It is interesting, because in every grant document, Nora wrote no family support for income verification, and it helped her qualify, so it is good that we do not need to fix that now." The words landed with a quiet thud, and Cassandra's smile flickered before freezing entirely, her eyes darting around to make sure no curious guests had overheard, although several absolutely had. I moved through the room greeting guests until I stopped near the lobby where the newly installed donor wall gleamed under soft lights, and the sight of it made my heart tighten, with a mix of pride and grief, because for the first time, my mother's name held the space it deserved. I had instructed the staff to remove every plaque that once said Mark and Cassandra Lane in honor of their tiny performative contributions, replacing them with a simple inscription that read, "In honor of Linda Lane and every mother who was told she did not understand money." And when my father stood in front of it during cocktail hour, his face went pale, as though the words themselves had called him out. He turned away quickly, blinking hard while Cassandra bit the inside of her cheek so forcefully she had to look down to steady herself. A little later, I found myself speaking with a small group of guests when an older couple approached me. People Cassandra often boasted about impressing, and they asked with warm curiosity, "So we heard your parents helped fund this place. Is that true?" And I felt a calm rise inside me as I answered my mother did in a way, because she taught me what money is really for and everything else is just paperwork. They nodded thoughtfully, smiling in that genuine way people do when they recognize integrity, and I could see Cassandra overhearing from a distance, gripping her wine glass like she wished it would shatter so she could blame the stemware instead of the truth. The night wore on with small victories, like that little shifts of perception in guests who had once taken Cassandra's word as gospel, and each one felt like reclaiming a piece of the dignity she had tried for years to strip from me. But the deeper consequences began to whisper their way into the evening, when a man I vaguely recognized from earlier, a friend of Elena's who worked in finance and compliance, stopped to greet Mark with courteous formality. And after exchanging pleasantries, he mentioned that some of the old transfers from Linda's insurance policies could raise questions if they were ever reported as charitable deductions, especially given recent changes in state audits. Mark stiffened his throat, tightening visibly, and Cassandra immediately forced a laugh and said, "Oh, that was all handled years ago." But the man only nodded politely, his expression unreadable, before wishing them a good night. I watched from across the room as my father sat down heavily, his hand trembling slightly, against the armrest, while Cassandra whispered something sharp and anxious into his ear, both of them suddenly looking far smaller than the grand personas they had performed for so long. Over the next few weeks, everything that had hovered like an unspoken warning during the wedding began to materialize, first through official-looking envelopes that arrived at their doorstep from the state tax division, then through follow-up letters from federal auditors who had flagged inconsistencies in their previous filings. Some of the donations they had claimed, including the ones they used to brag about at dinner parties, did not match the documentation, and several payments pulled from Linda's accounts years ago were now being examined because of possible misclassification. They could not dismiss any of it as a misunderstanding because tax language does not accept charm as currency, so they hired an attorney who charged by the hour and was known for being blunt with clients who had made careless financial choices. I heard bits and pieces from extended family who still kept in touch with me, quietly saying that Cassandra had been forced to cancel a planned vacation because they needed to cover preliminary legal fees, and that she had been complaining about the unfairness of audits targeting people who had simply tried to live well. But beneath her indignation was the undeniable truth that for the first time, their finances were being examined without the rose-tinted lens of their curated lifestyle, and the pressure began to weigh on them. Within another month, they had sold their boat, the one Cassandra loved, showing off in summer photos, and they downgraded their country club membership because the upgraded tier suddenly felt like an unjustifiable expense. Whenever they tried to explain it to friends, they blamed the economy, the new tax laws, anything that could preserve the illusion that their shrinking world was the result of external factors rather than years of siphoning money that had never belonged to them in the first place. Watching it unfold from a distance left me with a strange heaviness because this was not revenge in the dramatic, cinematic sense. There were no explosions, no ruinous collapse, but there was a slow, steady erosion of everything they had used to belittle me. Each loss a reminder that the lifestyle they flaunted had been built on someone else's foundation, and now the ground was finally correcting itself. The quiet payback tasted sharper than anything I had imagined because it was rooted in reality rather than spite, a simple balancing of what had been taken and what had been hidden. And as word continued spreading among friends and acquaintances, the same people who once admired Cassandra's curated image began asking careful questions, not accusatory but curious, in a way that stripped away her armor, leaving her unable to fabricate a version of events that matched both pride and truth. Meanwhile, I continued with my work preparing new programs for the Literacy Fund and settling into married life with Ethan. And each time I stepped into the community center, I felt the contrast between what I had built and what they were losing grow even sharper, not as schadenfreude, but as an affirmation that justice, when it arrives in small, steady increments, carries a dignity that loud revenge never could. About 8 months after the wedding, when my life had finally settled into something peaceful and steady with early evenings at the community center and quiet mornings with Ethan, I received a text from my father asking if we could meet at the small corner cafe we used to visit when I was a teenager, and although a part of me wanted to ignore it, something in the tone felt different, so I agreed. And when I arrived, he was already seated in a booth near the window, with his hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup that had gone cold long before I walked in, and I felt a jolt seeing how much older he looked, as though the last year had carved lines into him, faster than time usually allows. He tried to smile, but it faltered before reaching his eyes, and after a long breath, he admitted that the investigations had grown more complicated than they expected, because several transfers tied to my mother's insurance policies had been reviewed, and while they were not facing criminal charges, the state had imposed significant penalties, which forced them to liquidate more assets than they had planned. And the words came out in a flat, tired rhythm, as though he had repeated them many times in his head before speaking them aloud. I listened quietly, waiting to hear what he really wanted, and sure enough, after a moment, he looked at the table, rather than at me, and said, Cassandra thought that maybe I could help since I was the community hero now and people respected me. And perhaps if I were willing to write a letter explaining that the money they used years ago had been inspired by my mother's wishes, the auditors might see it as a misunderstanding rather than mismanagement. Before I could respond, he added that Cassandra believed it would protect me as well, because it could look bad for me if people thought my father mishandled my mother's funds. And something in me went very still, because it was obvious they had not come to take responsibility or apologize or acknowledge the years of dismissal and humiliation they had inflicted. They had come because they needed my reputation to clean the stains on theirs. He finally looked up, waiting for my reaction, and I answered slowly, choosing each word with calm precision as I told him, "My mother's money paid for your boat, your kitchen, your vacations, your status. Not my education, not my home, not this center, and I will not lie for you, not in a letter, not in a meeting, not between the lines." The silence stretched so long I could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, and then his face crumpled as though something inside him finally broke, because the truth had been spoken without cushioning or excuse, and he put a hand to his forehead, fighting tears that surprised even him. Cassandra did not cry, though she sat across from him with a defensive stiffness that made her look smaller than I had ever seen her, and for once she had no sharp retort, no polished narrative, no social armor left. I told my father that if he wanted a relationship with me, it could not be built on pretending none of this ever happened, and that the only path forward was honesty, even if it was uncomfortable, and even if it required a humility he had avoided for years. I suggested that if he wanted to reconnect, he could volunteer at the community center, starting with small tasks behind the scenes, where there would be no spotlight, no title, no donor plaque, just service and presence, and the chance to rebuild trust slowly, rather than demand it all at once. He nodded with a trembling breath, and for the first time in years I saw a glimpse of the man he once was, before grief and ego, and Cassandra's influence reshaped him into someone who needed status more than connection. Over the next months, he did come to the center, quietly helping stack chairs or set up classrooms or read with kids who struggled, and he never asked for recognition and never corrected people who assumed he was simply another retiree looking for something meaningful to do. And I allowed the distance between us to shrink only as far as felt safe, because healing is not about erasing the wound, but about deciding how much space you allow it to take. Cassandra never joined him. She drove past the building once in a while, her car slowing near the curb, just enough to show she was looking, but she never stepped out, perhaps because she sensed that the doors of this place would not open to the version of herself she had spent years constructing, the version built on wealth comparison and performance. One evening after locking up, I stood outside under the warm glow spilling from the newly renovated windows, watching the silhouettes of adults finishing a literacy class inside while a few kids flipped through ClearPath books, waiting for their parents. And in that soft, golden light, I felt my mother's presence like a quiet affirmation that what she had planted in me had finally grown into something sturdy enough to stand on its own. As I watched the last of the children run out laughing, I saw a familiar car slowing again on the street, and for a moment, Cassandra's face appeared in the driver's side window, illuminated by the passing headlights, not angry or triumphant, but strangely empty, as if she were mourning a world she no longer had the power to enter. She drove away without stopping, and I knew then that poetic justice rarely arrives with applause. Sometimes it is simply a door that remains closed to the people who once believed they owned the building. In the quiet that followed, I whispered to myself that maybe someone out there had also been told that their choices made them cheap, or had watched someone take what was theirs, then mock them for having less. And if they had ever lived that story, I hoped they would understand that sometimes the best revenge is not destroying the ones who hurt you, but building something they can never buy their way into. And if you were standing beside me in that moment, I would ask you what? I now ask the people who hear my story, If you were in my place, would you have written that letter for them? Or would you have walked away as I did? And if my journey speaks to you, then share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of quiet justice and long-awaited family karma. Because somewhere out there, another woman is standing behind a closed door, listening to judgments that are not hers to carry, and she may need to hear what happened when I finally refused to bow to mine.